Hi, I thought I'd talk with you for a few minutes about replicating tables that have duplicate rows. It's a topic that's come up in discussions with clients occasionally over the years. The first thing to say really is that that's fine. It's all right when tables have duplicate rows. And I guess to be clear, I'm not talking about the constraints on the database. Often you'll find that if you look at the definition of your source table, there won't be a primary key or unique index defined. There'll be just an index on some column defined. But if you looked at the application, talked with the application developers, you learn that in fact there is a logical uniqueness for the table. It's just that that's enforced by the application rather than the database. If that's the case, if there is uniqueness in the table, then you can ignore everything I'm talking about. Replication doesn't really care whether or not that uniqueness comes from the application enforcing it or the database enforcing it. What I'm talking about here is the case where there may be two rows in the table that have the same data value for every column. Generally, those tables are going to be audit trails of some sort. I've listed some examples here. Recording cell phone activity is a standard one we see, where cell phone companies are going to record all the activity that occurs for each client for the purposes of billing. So every time you send a text message or you make a call, they have to know what billing zone the call was, how long it was, what text message, that you sent a text message. And those rows will often have a timestamp because people care about when things occurred. But the granularity of that timestamp just may not be high enough to ensure that there's uniqueness. Again, if we talk about the cell phone example, text messages, and let's say the timestamp has granularity down to a millisecond. In general, that's going to provide sufficient uniqueness. But if I happen to send a long text message, depending on my provider and the network and other things that I'm sure I don't fully even understand, sometimes they'll decide to send that text message as two or more text messages, break it up into smaller ones because that's what the network likes. And in that case, I've sent one text message, but in fact it might send it as a couple, and those might occasionally get onto the network in the same millisecond. So I might end up with, from the purposes of billing, I've sent two text messages in the same millisecond. And really, in my experience working with clients, that's what I've seen is the case where there are duplicate rows. They tend to be relatively rare, but they'll exist. And you might have 1 million rows in your table, and out of those 1 million rows, you might have 100 that are duplicate. Sometimes there might be a higher, but that's really been my experience. So an important thing is that these duplicate rows contain useful data. It is valid data. It's an important part of the data in the table, so that when you're replicating the contents of that table to a target system, you want those duplicate rows to remain. You want the same, if there were 2 rows with the same values on the source, there should be 2 rows with those same sets of values on the target. You need to keep the duplicate rows as you replicate. So how can an application work with a table that's got duplicate rows? Because it can't identify a specific row in a where clause. You specify all the values, you'll find all the rows that have those values. And if you've got duplicate rows, sometimes there's more than one. And really, again, these tables really tend to be focused on the audit use case. So generally, they'll have insert operations done. When you see deletes or updates, they'll tend to be batch processing, what I think of as sort of pruning operations, where you may be deleting really old data from your table, or you may be updating the table to indicate a certain set of these rows has been processed in some fashion. It's being processed through your billing system, again, if they were cell phone activity data. And when that's done, these operations, these deletes or updates, they'll always affect all the duplicate rows in the same way. So if I'm deleting one of the duplicates, I'm deleting all of the duplicates. If I'm changing a value in one of the duplicates, I'm changing it in all of them. And that's important for replication, as you'll see. I should note that I'm talking about my experiences. This is what I've seen with our clients when we've talked about tables that have duplicate data. Databases have facilities in place to let you deal with them in a very different way. Oracle, for example, has a thing called a row ID, which is essentially a virtual column in a table that provides guaranteed uniqueness regardless of whether or not there's actual uniqueness in the data value. And you can capture row IDs when you insert rows. You can store them in another table as almost a foreign key relationship. So there are ways that you could create an application that had some different pattern of how it interacted with these sorts of tables with duplicate rows. So if you have source tables that have no uniqueness constraints on the table, you really probably have to talk to your application development team to understand maybe they have logical uniqueness, which is great. If they don't, talk with them to make sure that they follow the sort of pattern I'm talking about here. The key thing, as you'll see when we talk about how replication works, is the key thing is that if the application does change these duplicate rows, does it ever try to split them apart? Would there ever be a pair of duplicate rows that after it does some operations, they're no longer the same? So you'll want to talk with your application development team to see how they work with these tables. But I expect you'll find your experiences are similar to mine. You'll see it's the sort of what I'm describing here. So given that, how does replication work with such tables? And I'm talking specifically about IBM InfoSphere data replication here. That's the product that I work with most regularly. The simple answer is it works fine, but I'll give you a bit more detail. There's, of course, no impact on insert operations because you're not trying to identify a row through any sort of where clause in an insert operation. For updates and deletes, replication will just use all the columns in the target table as part of the where clause. And so the first update or delete one sees for a set of duplicate rows, that will change all of them. And then subsequent ones will just find no matching rows. But that's fine. Your target table still is in sync with the source. All the changes that on the source were applied to the target. In general, data replication may notice that an update found no rows or delete found no rows and consider that to be a problem. So to avoid that, to ensure that that doesn't cause any sort of problem, you can configure conflict resolution with a target wins resolution strategy so that replication can understand that it can safely ignore the subsequent operations that find no matching rows. And that's it. Thanks.